Psalm 108 this morning. Again, a delight to have each of you. Here's the story with Psalm 108. It's really distinctive in the following way. It is fully composed of two other psalms, half of two other psalms. So it took half of Psalm 57 to begin with verses 8 to 12, and then took the second half of Psalm 60, verses 7 to 14, put them together, and voila, something new. So, a little context in that regard. First of all, scholars will ask which came first. Psalm 108, was it taken apart or did it put together? And some scholars say you can't tell. Others, like a book that I much rely on by Rosenberg and Zlotowitz, they point out to the name of God here in verse 2, which is a quote from 5780 that uses the name of God as Elohim. And these two scholars, Rosenberg and Zlotowitz, identify with those scholars who say that in the fifth book, which we're now in, of Psalms, when it's an original composition for the fifth book, which is a latter compositions relatively, it uses Yud He Vav He, Adonai. So when it's quoting, which it is, and uses Elohim, for some scholars, that means that Psalm 57 came first, and then 57 and 60 were put together here. Psalm 57, I reread it this morning to get oriented, deals with, as does 60, two moments in King David's life. You remember those earlier Psalms, biography of King David. Psalm 57 has David fleeing from King Saul. And he's feeling threatened. He's a young man by the mighty ruler of Israel. And this psalm will pick up at verse 8. Verses 1 to 7 describe his fleeing. And verse 7, right before this begins, will say, regarding David's foes, they prepared a net for my feet. My soul was bowed low. They dug a pit for me, but they fell into it. And I always like this image that those who dig a pit to injure, in this case, David, fall into their own pit. And then beginning with verse 8, the beginning of this psalm, are words of celebration. And you will hear, therefore, if you were with us when we did Psalm 57, that wonderful image, I will wake the dawn. And I talked about that Brazilian movie of the guy with the guitar waking up dawn. So this psalm begins with the second half of Psalm 57, words of celebration. It's very personal. It's the I. It's the story of King David being saved. Now, very different is the second half that we'll see in a moment, and that's taken from Psalm 60. Here too, the psalmist picks up and quotes the second half of a psalm. So we're not given context. In this case, verses 7 to 14. Now, the beginning of this psalm, also a psalm of David, is when he fought a battle against 12,000. But in this case, verse 3, God rejected us. You have broken us open. You have been angry. So in this case, the beginning of the psalm, before we get to where we're going to get to, is about a military defeat. Psalm 57 is about an individual. Psalm 60 is about the community. And there's even a quality of bitterness and then a plea a plea that God should allow the people to become victorious going forward. Now, Psalm 108. You don't have any of that context, though here distinctly, which is rare. We haven't seen this in Psalm 101. Here, Psalm 108, a Psalm of David. So there is a resonance with King David. And as you hear this psalm, know that some of the medieval scholars would see these words as an address to King David with God's promise. There is an oracle in verse 8. Other medieval commentators, Radak and Sforno, they will see this as a description not of the time of King David, but of the messianic future. We've seen that move before. So with that, Psalm 108. Let me read it with us, and then I'll take it apart a bit. With God, we will do valiantly, taken from the last verse. A song, a psalm of David. Ready is my heart, God. I will sing, I will hymn with all my glory. Awake, the lute and lyre. I will wake the dawn. I will give thanks to you among the peoples, Adonai, and I will hymn of you, praises among the nations. For greater than the heavens is your kindness, and until the skies is your truth. Rise up over heavens, God, and over all the earth, your glory, so that your beloved ones may be rescued. Deliver with your right hand and answer me. God has spoken in God's holiness that I would delight. I will divide Shechem and the valley of Sukkot. I will measure out. Mine is Gilead, mine is Manasseh. Ephraim is my stronghold. Judah is my scepter. Moab is my wash basin. Upon Edom do I toss my shoe. Over Philistia do I shout out. Who will bring me to a fortified city? Who will lead me to Edom? Is it not God who abandoned us? And who would not go forth, God with our troops? Grant us help against the foe, for futile is the deliverance of a mortal. With God we will do valiantly, for God will trample our foes. After a long psalm yesterday, and I will foreshadow a long psalm tomorrow, it's nice to have a shorter psalm to take a little bit more time with some of the word choices and some of the translation choices. So here, a psalm or a hymn of David. The first word, again, this divides as verses 2 to 6. Those are quoting verse 57 with some subtle changes that may be scribal errors or purposeful. I'll point those out in a moment. And then verse here 7 to 14 is chapter 60, verses 7 to 14. And so there is an elegant segue in that here, verses 6 and 7 come from the two different psalms, but they work neatly together. And in this case, I even kept it verse 7 as if 6 and 7 go together. Here's what's nice about this bridge between 6 and 7 and remarkable. Rise up over heavens, God, and over all the earth, your glory. Verses 1 to 5 is just praising God. Remember, in the other psalm, it comes after victory. Here, it's the introduction. The psalm begins with words of celebration that might also be viewed as softening up God, seeking God's favor, or alternatively, gaining self-confidence. And yet, verse 7, verse 6, rise up over heavens, God, and over the earth your glory. That foreshadows a call for deliverance. It can be read either way, meaning it can be read as, may you be exalted. That's one way to read it. Or it can be, which is the way Radak reads it and Adin Steinsaltz, reveal your presence. So verse 6 is, rise up over heavens, God, and over the earth your glory, not for purposes of us necessarily looking up to you for praise, but for you coming down to enable us in battle. And then verse 7, which is now the other psalm, is also remarkable because it's the rare verse in Psalm 60 that's personal rather than national. They're both anomalous. So that your beloved ones may be rescued. Deliver with your right hand and answer me. So the answer me is the anomaly in verse 60, because otherwise it's national. But here we get this bridge between the two verses of a call for deliverance. Now back to the beginning. Nachon libi Elohim. Ready is my heart, God. I will sing. I will hymn with all my glory. Now, ready, I translate, and again, I follow other translators, as I am now ready to sing. Nachon is an ambiguous word, and it is often translated as steadfast is my heart. And Radak, who will again see this as pointing to a future redemption, will say, steadfast despite this long galut, despite this long exile. Or it could be more positive, namely, I am so ready, God, to sing to you, to him with all my glory. Now, the word kavod, glory, is understood as what God is identified with. We speak of God's glory, and therefore my glory is that aspect of the divine within me. So I sing, I will hymn with all my soul, is the way that some will translate here the word glory. And Robert Alter, that modern literature professor at Berkeley, he often looks for what he would identify, as other Bible scholars, as scribal errors, alterations. So kivodi, without the vav, is kivedi, my liver. My liver is understood as my conscience, my inward being. And that's how Robert Alter translates the end of verse 2. I will hymn with my inward being, because he sees kivodi as really kivedi. All right, now verse 3. Awake the lute and lyre. These two musical instruments, lute and lyre, are surmises. We don't know exactly what these instruments are. I chose to translate it as lute and lyre, like Richard Levy and Martin Cohen, contemporaries. But I'll point out in the Chabad translation, they flip it as awake the lyre and the lute, and others will have it as harp and lyre. So I just circle Hanevel v'chinor. You might also know Hanevel v'chinor in Yerushalayim Shel Zahav. That Naomi Shemer poem and song has this verse resonant as well. And again, it's the verse from Psalm 57:9. And here, lute and lyre may be personified. So he's poetically speaking of the lute and lyre as needing to be wakened up. And likewise, you can read Ayira Shachar as I will wake the dawn, as the image of dawn as well being personified, that he will wake up the dawn. Or it can be read as I will wake at dawn. There is a beautiful and popular play in the Talmud on verse 3, Brachot 3b, about King David, where King David there in the Talmud says, other kings, they sleep until the dawn of the morning wakes them. Not me. I am already up at midnight praying to God. And the story then in Talmud is told of him putting a miniature harp, a lyre, on his door. And at midnight, the north wind blew, strumming the lyre, awaking David at midnight. In later Hasidic tradition, perhaps in part due to that popular telling of King David communing with God, to do a yichud with a rebbe, to draw close to a rebbe for counsel or for a bracha, the goal was to be as close to midnight because that's when heaven and earth meet. And more, interestingly, in researching this, Rashba, Shlomo ibn Adret, was a very influential teacher, lived in Barcelona, 1235 to 1310. Yesterday, his name came up in my research in reference to Kaporet, the swinging of the chicken, and that he was against it early on and was an influence on Joseph Caro. Interestingly, Rashba, this is such a popular story of the wind blowing from the north to wake David at midnight, who would then be up before dawn, that Rashba describes this event as a water clock, with literally water being accumulated drop by drop, so that at midnight there was a mechanism that he writes about in the 13th, 14th century that would then create the strumming at midnight, but a water clock mechanism, which again I hadn't seen before. When you're in Jerusalem, go to the Islamic Museum near the Prime Minister's, near the President's home. They have one of the world's great collection of clocks, of water clocks, and Louis and Marie Antoinette's kind of modern Apple Watch. It's quite remarkable. But anyway, water clocks, Rashba, and the Islamic Museum to get context. So back moving through the Psalm, verse 4, one small change from Psalm 57. Here it's in verse 4, Yud He Vav He, the third word. There it's Adonai. Verse 5, also one small change. And again, it could be scribal because they are synonyms, but not. Ki Gadol Me'al, for God is greater. Me'al can mean from above the heavens, so greater than the heavens. In Psalm 57, verse 11, it's Ki Gadol Ad Shamayim, God is great until the heavens. Now that's, greater than or until is pretty small, but here the Talmud will comment, Psachim 50b, that here in Psalm 106, one who does a mitzvah l'shem shamayim, a mitzvah only for God's sake, is considered to be even greater than the heavens. And in reference to Psalm 57, to do it not for the sake of heaven, but for one's own rewards, is only to do it until heaven. Just, you don't reach as high. There you go. One word, rabbis have opportunities to spin. With that said, those are really the only changes. One little change, and that is instead of af kvodi, which is with all my glory, in 57, it's Ashira v'Zamra, I will sing and I will hymn, Ura kavodi, to awake my glory, awaken my glory. So now the second half, we now shift to Psalm 60. Here, one eye on the clock, we only have 5 minutes in this part. So inclusios, the first part, verses 2 and verse 6, have the same word of kavod, glory. That's its bracket, its frame. Verse 7 has the word Hoshea, which will reappear as Tishuot in verse 13. So the first part, the key word is God's honor. The second half, the inclusio, the key word is deliverance, Hoshea. And that's what the focus is on the second half. So that your beloved ones may be rescued, deliver with your right hand and answer me. And now verse 8. Who is God speaking about is unclear. Namely, God has spoken in God's holiness, and bikodsho can also mean in God's sanctuary. Either way, which could mean this is a Levite hearing. And what is it that God has spoken? What is the oracle? Here, as I chose to translate the word eloza, that I would delight. It can also mean that I will exalt. And the I can either refer to God, that God would delight, or that David would delight. And likewise, on the other side of the colon, that God will divide Shechem, or that David will divide Shechem. It can be read both ways. Benjamin Siegel, in his commentary, says that is the artfulness of the ambiguity, namely, that both can be true simultaneously. This is a description of hope for David, but also a description of God's power, that God will give to David, or God will simply manifest independently, a division of Shechem. And for the medieval commentators, 106 will be pointing to the future. These three cities in verse 9, Gilad, Menashe, and Ephraim, are places that Jacob visited in returning to the land. Moab, Edom, and Philistia are the enemies. 9 are, if you will, the allies. 10 are the enemies who God will help take over. Here too, ambiguity. Edom, here I translate, do I toss my shoe? That is the way Radak understands it. It's one way, but Na'al can be a shoe or a lock. Rashi understands it upon Edom, do I cast my lock? Meaning, do I grip tightly? Likewise, Philistia, that's the Philistines, those on the coast, do I shout out, et ro'ah? Differences of understanding. As Steinsaltz will translate it, will deliver a crushing defeat. Robert Alter, shout exultantly. You can see the trua, like the sound of the shofar in etroa. It's a rare use of the trua, etroa, but it's a sense of shouting out in victory, or as Rashi will say, shouting out to terrify the foe. And now moving to 11, again, we're still quoting Psalm 60. Who will bring me to a fortified city? Who will lead me to a dome? Those are rhetorical questions. Obviously, for the psalmist, it's God. But remember, Psalm 60 is about the earlier defeat. That's the opening of the psalm. Is it not God who abandoned us, and who would not go forth, God with our troops? And in analyzing 60, there's this quality of ambiguity about the psalmist's trust in God in the shadow of a defeat. But here, it's a way to understand it is God may have abandoned us before, but not now. God is with us now. Grant us help against the foe, for futile is the deliverance of a mortal. You can't rely, Adam, mortal. You can't rely only on humans. You need God for victory. And here too, the final verse, with God we will do valiantly. Here's some other alternative translations of 14a. Through God we shall act the hero. That's Richard Levy. Art scroll. Through God we shall form an army. I do it like Ashes Chayil, a woman of valor, a woman of strength. With God we will do valiantly. I choose to translate it as partnership. Some translate this as through God, as Art Scroll did and Richard Levy. I like, and the bay can be either with God, as do other translators, the sense that ultimately for us to have our strength, we need to feel God's presence in our lives. For God will trample our foes. That's a strong word, trample, but that's its literal use of yavus. Some, like Steinsaltz, will say, for God will rout our foes, which softens it. But here, back to Na'al, that we saw earlier in verse 10, that's the sense of, we will trample, we'll run forward, our horses. That's an image of ancient warfare, will trample our foes. To pull this now together, here's a cute piece. For like Sforno, he's in Italy, 1475 to 1550. All this is messianic. What is the chayil? What is the force? It's our learning. We will have great scholars in the messianic future, and as a result, we will have God's presence to defeat all our foes. What I love about this as an act of creativity is two halves, the second half of two other psalms written earlier are put together. We don't know what prompts the need. It can either be a later time hearing the words of the past provide a sense of ongoing connection to God, that sense of familiarity that meets a new moment, a moment of I will wake up the dawn, I will sing to God, and I know God will be with me. A song of a warrior awaking in the morning with confidence in God and in himself. Confidence that comes from the resonance of familiar words past, in which there was a victory pointed to in the aftermath of defeat in the past, giving courage, hope, and a sense of partnership in meeting a current or future need. Is this written for the messianic future? Probably that's more of a later Jewish reading of its origins, and yet that is how this Psalm 108 served our ancestors. Our ancestors in Galut, in exile, read 108 as the promise that God will enable us victories of ultimate victory. And the last comment, what is our purpose? As pointed out by Richard Levy, our purpose, God, is I will hymn of your praises among the nations. It's universal. It's not just for me that I seek victory. We seek victory to fulfill our role as the nation that kindles your presence among all nations. In that sense, there is this messianic trajectory, but it may have not been necessarily messianic in its origin, but it is, in either case, a description of how we see our purpose, allow our victory to spread your glory among all peoples. So with that, Psalm 108, an act of creativity. I invite some reactions, comments, to personalize and understand these words. Anything today? All right, so I still don't see a hand. Let me tell you a couple things about the psalm. All right, I'm going to put up the psalm again. And feel free to unmute to ask a question. But here's some things to know. Verse 7 are familiar words to many of us in that they're part of the closing paragraph of the Amida. Elohai nitzor l'shoni mira, God guard my tongue from evil. And then right after that is verse 7, so that your beloved ones may be rescued, delivered with your right hand and answer me. The Amida is a messianic plea. God complete creation. It ends with that image. And it includes here verse 7 in its conclusion. Here's another piece of artistry. And that is the words in verse 11 and verse 13. Miftsar and mitzar. They sound very similar. There's only one letter different, but they're very different. A miftsar is a fortified city. A mitzar is from a foe. So here, know again that psalms were sung, psalms were heard, and one of the reoccurring patterns in the psalms is assonance, words that sound the same but have a play of words. And that's one remarkable example, mivtsar and mitzar. One more, and then I'll pause to see if any comments, and we'll pull it together. Here's another example of earlier biblical imagery and ambiguity. Verse 9, Judah mechokeki is my scepter. That's part of Judah, part of Jacob's blessings for Judah. Genesis chapter 49, verse 10. Jacob will say of Judah, Judah is my scepter. But in that place, namely in Genesis, Ibn Ezra will understand it as Judah is my scribe. Rashi will say Judah is my scholar. Radak will say Judah is my lawgiver. And it can, of course, be all. But chokeke, scepter, implies the one who will rule. And Judah will be, in the time of King David, the source of rule. Modern Bible scholars will look at those blessings of Judah and say they are written after King David, elevating Judah. In either case, it's always fascinating for me to see how words used in a psalm are often an echo of a moment earlier in the Bible. That's part one. And part two, how those words are parsed with very different understandings. Okay, now I get to see you again. Can or Shula, a comment?
Again, just because I love language and nobody else had their hand up, I have a weird little offering for verse 10.
Yes.
The word etroa.
Yes.
The general gist of verse 10 is, Moab is my wash basin. Edom, I'm tossing a shoe at. The general feeling is these guys who are our enemies, I can kind of wipe the floor with them. And so etroa, I'm going to the idea that rea and reut are friendships. It's the word for friend, and therefore, in the same sense and feel as wash basin and tossing my shoe, with the plishtim, I can enjoy my friends. I can party over those.
So let me play with that verse 10. First, to summarize what Shula says, there's a contrast with the Philistines, and a way to understand this is I can party or play with them, which can be understood positively or negatively. And in fact, here there is a subtle change between Psalm 108 and Psalm 60 on that very word. In Psalm 60, in it's instead of et roa with an aleph, which means I will shout out, it's instead a hey, het roa. So just one letter is different, the first one, which gets translated as join yourself with me, which is your image, which is, and that's how it's translated in Psalm 60, is I will, and Rashi understands that to mean join yourself to me, surrender yourself. So Philistines, again, controlled the coast. They had chariots. They were a powerful enemy in that time. This is understood with you who are the mightiest of all these enemies, the Philistines, at the time of King David, join yourself with me. The other images here, which is a segue to tomorrow, is Moab is my wash basin. Well, a wash basin is where there's dirty water. Rashi says these are words of contempt. It's also in Isaiah 16:6, which means you're going to be to me like, water that you throw away because it's dirty. And Edom, do I toss my shoe? To toss a shoe is understood by some, like Radak, is like a servant who ties your shoes for you. So that's one. What came to my mind is more commonly now in the Muslim community to throw a shoe, like in Iraq at President Bush, is the greatest sign of contempt, because the shoe, the bottom of a shoe is what picks up all the muck as you walk along. So in either case, you have this sense of words of degradation for the enemy. Moab is my wash basin. Upon Edom do I toss my shoe. And with ambiguity, as Shula points out, over Philistia, do I shout out or do I invite to join? Do I party? The last piece in that regard is this unusual word has two ayins at the end. Ayin doesn't have a sound. It's the throat getting in position to speak. Etro-ah. And the sense is back to trua. Here you got the added ayin. It's prolonged with Philistia. So a poetic addition of the ayin to convey a shout that continues. to pull this together for today, what I'm fascinated by is how much there is to say about something we've already read. And the art of creativity is to take things that already exist and to juxtapose them. The image I used in inviting us to study today is a chef who brings together two different kinds of taste, the sweet and the sour, whatever they might be, that creates an element of a new taste, a surprise. Psalm 108 is a new taste, a surprise. Words that point to beginning a day in celebration, awakening the dawn, looking forward to danger but with hope of victory, perhaps looking forward like etroah to a sustained partnership or celebration of a world that hears God, that hears Israel sing of God's glory. With that, I now look to Arnold Sugarman for a few words about what studying Psalms has meant to you, and then the saying of Kaddish.
Oh,
Arnold.
first of all, Rabbi, thank you very much for honoring me today. Uh, you brought up the fact that I'm from Toledo. Couple of words about Toledo. I don't know if you can see this, but I'm wearing my Toledo Mud Hen shirt, and I learned two very important life lessons from the Toledo Mud Hens. They were the perennial doormats of the American Association baseball team. And from them, I learned humility and to root for the underdogs. And you also brought up, Toledo, Spain. The name of the local newspaper was the Toledo Blade, and under the masthead, one of America's great newspapers, which at the time I was growing up, I believe it was. So, I participate in your presentations of Psalms for a variety of reasons. The intellectual satisfies my intellectual curiosity. I learned some history. I learned the meaning of Psalms at the time they were written, and what they meant to what they mean to us today. But the other reason that I joined the group is, we're all on Zoom, but it's given me a chance to meet a number of very nice people. And I look forward to the day when we can all sit around the table with a little glass of schnapps and some kichel and have a nice conversation. That and that image is what I remember from when I was growing up. I was part of the junior congregation. And at the end of our Saturday morning service, we would go into the main room of the temple, and we would have a little lunch. And at the other table were, I called them the old men, who were sitting around with a little glass of schnapps and their kichel, and the gabbai giving a section from the Talmud in Yiddish, and that's the memory that's one of the memories that I have, and so again, looking forward to that time when we can all sit around the table, have a nice conversation.
Thank you,
very
Arnold.
much.
I have to pull this together. Arnold, thank you for those words, both of your own Toledo origins and the humility that comes with rooting for the local team, and the image as a boy of the Kiddush with a little l'chaim and a little kichel to go with it, which only means I'm just beginning to think about creating a siyum. It's traditional to have a party at the end, and God willing, in June-ish, when I complete Psalms, maybe we'll have an in-person gathering to drink a l'chaim. So thank you, Arnold.